what will be at stake will not just be cool products, but whether liberal democracy survives, whether the CCP survives, what the world order for the next century will be. The CCP is going to have an all-out effort to infiltrate American AI labs, billions of dollars, thousands of people. CCP is going to try to outbuild us. People don't realize how intense state-level espionage can be. When we have literal superintelligence on our cluster, and they can Stuxnet the Chinese data centers, you really think that'll be a private company, and the government would be oh my God, what is going on? I do think it is incredibly important that these clusters are in the United States. I mean, would you do the Manhattan Project in the UAE, right? 2023 was the sort of moment for me where it went from kind of AGI as a sort of theoretical abstract thing, and you'd make the models to I see it, I feel it. I can see the cluster where it's trained on, the rough combination of algorithms, the people, how it's happening. And I think, most of the world is not, most of the people feel it are right here, right?
Okay, today I'm chatting with my friend Leopold Aschenbrenner. He grew up in Germany, graduated valedictorian of Columbia when he was 19. And then he had a very interesting gap year, which we'll talk about. And then he was on the OpenAI super alignment team, may it rest in peace. And now he, with some anchor investments from Patrick and John Collison and Daniel Gross and Nat Friedman, is launching an investment firm. So Leopold, I know you're off to a slow start, but life is long and I wouldn't worry about it too much. You'll make up for it in due time. But thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you. I first discovered your podcast when your best episode had, a couple hundred views. And so it's been amazing to follow your trajectory, and it's a delight to be on.
Yeah. Well, I think in the Schulter and Trenton episode, I mentioned that a lot of the things I've learned about AI, I've learned from talking with them. And the third part of this triumvirate, probably the most significant in terms of the things that I've learned about AI, has been you. We'll get all this stuff on the record now.
Great.
Okay, first thing to get on record. Tell me about the $1 trillion cluster. But by the way, I should mention, so the context of this podcast is today you're releasing a series called Situational Awareness. We're going to get into it. First question about that is, tell me about the $1 trillion cluster.
Yeah. So, unlike basically most things that have come out of Silicon Valley recently, AI is kind of this industrial process. The next model doesn't just require, some code. It's building a giant new cluster. Now it's building giant new power plants. Pretty soon it's going to be building giant new fabs. And since ChatGPT, this kind of extraordinary sort of techno-capital acceleration has been set into motion. I mean, basically, exactly a year ago today, NVIDIA had their first kind of blockbuster earnings call, right? Where it went out 25% after hours, and everyone was like, "Oh my God, AI, it's a thing." I think within a year, NVIDIA data center revenue has gone from a few billion a quarter to 20, 25 billion a quarter now, and continuing to go up. Big tech capex is skyrocketing, and it's funny because it's both. There's this kind of crazy scramble going on, but in some sense, it's just the sort of continuation of straight lines on a graph, right? There's this kind of long run trend, basically almost a decade of sort of training compute of the sort of largest AI systems growing by about half an order of magnitude, 0.5 booms a year. And you can just kind of play that forward, right? So, GPT-4, rumored or reported to have finished pre-training in 2022. The sort of cluster size there was rumored to be about 25,000 H100s. A100s on semi-analysis. That's roughly if you do the math on that, it's maybe a $500 million cluster. It's very roughly 10 megawatts. Just play that forward, half an ohm a year, right? So then 2024, that's that's a cluster that's 100 megawatts. That's 100,000 H100 equivalents. That's costs in the billions. Play it forward, 2 more years, 2026. That's a cluster that's a gigawatt. That's sort of a large nuclear reactor size. It's the power of the Hoover Dam. That costs tens of billions of dollars. That's 1 million H100 equivalents. 2028, that's a cluster that's 10 gigawatts, right? That's more power than kind of most US states. That's 10 million H100s equivalents. Costs hundreds of billions of dollars. And then 2030, $1 trillion cluster, 100 gigawatts, over 20% of US electricity production. 100 million H100 equivalents. And that's just the training cluster, right? That's the one largest training cluster. And then there's more inference GPUs as well, right? Most of once there's products, most of them are going to be inference GPUs. And so, U.S. power production has barely grown for decades, and now we're really in for a ride.
So, I mean, when I had Zuck on the podcast, he was claiming not a plateau per se, but that AI progress would be bottlenecked by specifically this constraint on energy, and specifically gigawatt data centers are going to build another Three Gorges Dam or something. I know that there's companies, according to public reports, who are planning things on the scale of a gigawatt data center. 10 gigawatt data center, who's going to be able to build that? I mean, a 100 gigawatt center, like a state, where are you going to pump that into one physical data center? How is it going to be possible?
Yeah.
What is Zuck missing?
I mean, I don't know. I think the 10 gigawatt, like 6 months ago, 10 gigawatts was the talk of the town. I mean, I feel like now, people have moved on. 10 gigawatts is happening. I mean, I don't know. There's the information report on OpenAI and Microsoft planning a $100 billion cluster. So, you got to, if you
is that the gigawatt or is that the 10 gigawatt?
I mean, I don't know, but if you try to like map out,
Sure.
how expensive would the 10 gigawatt cluster be, that's maybe a couple $100 billion. So it's sort of on that scale. And they're planning it. They're working on it. It's not just sort of my crazy take. I mean, AMD, I think forecasted a $400 billion AI accelerator market by 2027. I think it's, and AI accelerators are only part of the expenditures. It's sort of, I think sort of $1 trillion of sort of like total AI investment by 2027 is sort of like, we're very much on track on. I think the $1 trillion cluster is going to take a bit more sort of acceleration, but we saw how much sort of ChatGPT unleashed, right? And so like every generation, the models are going to be kind of crazy and it's going to shift the Overton window. And then obviously the revenue comes in, right? So these are forward-looking investments. The question is, do they pay off, right? And so if we sort of estimated the GPT-4 cluster at around 500 million. By the way, that's sort of a common mistake people make, is they say, people say like $100 million for GPT-4, but that's just the rental price, right? They're like, you rent the cluster for 3 months. But it's, if you're building the biggest cluster, you got to build the whole cluster. You got to pay for the whole cluster. You can't just rent it for 3 months.
But can't you?
But then, I mean, really, once you're trying to get into the sort of hundreds of billions, I mean, eventually you got to get to like 100 billion a year revenue.
Okay.
I mean, I think this is where it gets really interesting for the big tech companies, right? Because like their revenues are on order, hundreds of billions, right? So it's like 10 billion, fine, and it'll pay off the 2024 size training cluster. But really, when sort of big tech, it'll be gangbusters, is 100 billion a year. And so the question is sort of how feasible is 100 billion a year from AI revenue? And it's a lot more than right now. But I think if you sort of believe in the trajectory of the AI systems as I do, and which we'll probably talk about, it's not that crazy, right? So I think there's like 300 million ish Microsoft Office subscribers, right? And so they have Copilot now, and I don't know what they're selling it for, but suppose you sold some sort of AI add-on for $100 a month. And you sold that to, a third of Microsoft Office subscribers subscribe to that. That'd be 100 billion right there. $100 a month is, a lot.
That's a lot, yeah.
It's a lot. But
for a third of Office subscribers?
Yeah, but it's for the average knowledge worker, it's like a few hours of productivity a month. And it's, kind of like, you have to be expecting pretty lame AI progress to not hit like, some few hours of productivity a month yeah.
Okay, sure. So let's assume all this.
Yeah.
What happens in the next few years in terms of what is the 1 gigawatt training, the AI that's trained on the 1 gigawatt data center? What can it do, the one on the 10 gigawatt data center? Just map out the next few years of AI progress for me.
Yeah, I think probably the sort of 10 gigawatt-ish range is sort of my best guess for when we get the sort of true AGI. I mean, yeah, I think it's sort of like 1 gigawatt data center. And again, I think actually compute is overrated, and we're going to talk about that, but we'll talk about compute right now. So, I think sort of 25, 26, we're going to get models that are, basically smarter than most college graduates. I think sort of a lot of the economic usefulness, I think, really depends on sort of unhobbling. Basically, it's, the models are kind of, they're smart, but they're limited, right? There's this chatbot, and things like being able to use a computer, things like being able to do kind of like agentic long horizon tasks.
Yeah.
And then I think by 27, 28, if you extrapolate the trends and we'll talk about that more later, and I talk about it in the series, I think we hit, basically, like as smart as the smartest experts. I think the unhobbling trajectory kind of points to, it looks much more like an agent than a chatbot. And much more almost like basically like a drop-in remote worker, right? So it's not like, I think basically, I think this is the sort of question on the economic returns. I think a lot of the intermediate AI systems could be really useful, but it actually just takes a lot of schlep to integrate them, right? Like GPT-4, whatever, 4.5, probably there's a lot you could do with them in a business use case, but you really got to change your workflows to make them useful. And it's just like, there's a lot of, it's a very Tyler Cowen-esque take. It just takes a long time to diffuse. It's like, we're an SF and so we missed that or whatever. But I think in some sense, the way a lot of these systems want to be integrated is you kind of get this sort of sonic boom where it's, the sort of intermediate systems could have done it, but it would have taken schlep. And before you do the schlep to integrate them, you get much more powerful systems that are sort of unhobbled. And so they're this agent and there's this drop-in remote worker. And, and then you're kind of interacting with them like a coworker, right? You can do Zoom calls with them and you're slacking them and you're like, can you do this project? And then they go off and they, go away for a week and write a first draft and get feedback on them and, run tests on their code. And then they come back and you see it and you tell them a little bit more things or, and that'll be much easier to integrate. And so, it might be that actually you need a bit of overkill to make the sort of transition easy and to really harvest the gains.
What do you mean by the overkill? Overkill on the model capabilities?
Yeah. So basically, the intermediate models could do it, but it would take a lot of schlep. So then, the like, actually, it's just the drop-in remote worker kind of AGI that can automate, cognitive tasks that actually just ends up kind of like, basically, it's your like, the intermediate models would have made the software engineer more productive, but, will the software engineer adopt it? And then the, 27 model is, you just don't need the software engineer. You can literally interact with it like a software engineer, and it'll do the work of a software engineer.
So the last episode I did was with John Schulman.
Yeah.
And I was asking about basically this. And one of the questions I asked is, we have these models that have been coming out in the last year, and none of them seem to have significantly surpassed GPT-4, and certainly not in the agentic way in which they are interacting with as a coworker. They'll brag that they got a few extra points on MMLU or something. And even GPT-4o, it's cool that they can talk like Scarlett Johansson or something, but like... and honestly, I'm going to use that. Well, I guess not anymore. Not anymore. Okay, but the whole coworker thing... So this is going to be a run-on question, but you can address it in any order. But it makes sense to me why they'd be good at answering questions. They have a bunch of data about how to complete Wikipedia text or whatever. Where is the equivalent training data that enables it to understand what's going on in the Zoom call? How does this connect with what they were talking about in the Slack? What is the cohesive project that they're going after based on all this context that I have? Where is that training data coming from?
Yeah, so I think a really key question for sort of AI progress in the next few years is sort of how hard is it to do sort of unlock the test time compute overhang. Mm-hmm. So, right now GPT-4 answers a question and, it kind of can do a few hundred tokens of kind of chain of thought. And that's already a huge improvement, right? Sort of like, this is a big unhobbling. Before, answer a math question, it's just shotgun. And, if you try to kind of like answer a math question by saying the first thing that came to mind, you wouldn't be very good. So, GPT-4 thinks for a few hundred tokens. And, if I thought for a few hundred, if I think at like 100 tokens a minute, and I thought for
you think it much more than 100 tokens a minute.
I don't know. If I thought for like 100 tokens a minute, it's like what GPT-4 does. Maybe it's like, it's equivalent to me thinking for 3 minutes or whatever, right? Suppose GPT-4 could think for millions of tokens, right? That's sort of plus 4 ohms, plus 4 orders of magnitude on test time compute, just like on one problem. It can't do it right now. It kind of gets stuck, right? It like writes some code, even if it, you can do a little bit of iterative debugging, but eventually it just kind of like, it kind of gets stuck in something. It can't correct its errors and so on. And, in a sense, there's this big overhang, right? In like other areas of ML, there's this great paper on AlphaGo, right? Where you can trade off train time and test time compute. And if you can use, 4 ohms more test time compute, that's almost like, a 3.5 ohm bigger model. Just because, again, like you can, if 100 tokens a minute, a few million tokens, that's a few months of sort of working time. There's a lot more you can do in a few months of working time than right now. So the question is, how hard is it to unlock that? And I think the sort of short timelines AI world is if it's not that hard. And the reason it might not be that hard is that, there's only really a few extra tokens you need to learn, right? You need to kind of learn the error correction tokens, the tokens where you're like, I think I made a mistake. Let me think about that again. You need to learn the kind of planning tokens. That's kind of like, I'm going to start by making a plan. Here's my plan of attack. And then I'm going to write a draft. And I'm going to now I'm going to critique my draft. I'm going to think about it. And so it's not things that models can do right now, but the question is, how hard is that? And in some sense also, there's sort of two paths to agents, right? When Schulte was on your podcast, he talked about kind of scaling leading to more nines of reliability. And so that's one path. I think the other path is this sort of like unhobbling path where it needs to learn this kind of like system 2 process. And if it can learn this sort of system 2 process, it can just use kind of millions of tokens and think for them and be cohesive and be coherent. One analogy. So when you drive, here's an analogy. When you drive, right? Okay, you're driving. And most of the time you're kind of on autopilot, right? You're just kind of driving and you're doing well. And then, but sometimes you hit like a weird construction zone or a weird intersection, and then I sometimes like, my passenger seat, my girlfriend, I'm kind of like, be quiet for a moment. I need to like figure out what's going on, right? And that's sort of like, you go from autopilot to like the system 2 is jumping in and you're thinking about how to do it. And so the scaling is improving that system 1 autopilot. And I think it's the brute force way to get to kind of agents. If you just improve that sort of system, but if you can get that system 2 working, then, I think you could like quite quickly jump, to sort of this like more agentified, test time compute overhang is unlocked.
What's the reason to think that this is an easy win in the sense that, oh, you just get there's like some loss function that easily enables you to train it to enable the system 2 thinking.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of animals that have system 2 thinking, you know, it like took a long time for evolution to give us system 2 thinking.
Yeah.
The pre-training, it like, listen, I get it. You got like trillions of tokens of internet text. I get that. Like, you like match that and you get all these, all this pre-training capabilities. What's the reason to think that this is an easy and hobbling?
Yeah. So, okay, a bunch of things. So, I mean, first of all, pre-training is magical, right? And it gave us this huge advantage for models of general intelligence because you just predict the next token, but predicting the next token, I mean, this is sort of a common misconception, but what it does is it lets this model learn these incredibly rich representations, right? Like these sort of representation learning properties are the magic of deep learning. You have these models, and instead of learning just kind of like, whatever, statistical artifacts or whatever, it learns sort of these models of the world. That's also why they can kind of like generalize, right? Because it learned the right representations. Sure. And so, you pre-train these models and you have this sort of like raw bundle of capabilities that's really useful and sort of this almost unformed raw mass. And sort of the unhobbling we've done over sort of like GPT-2 to GPT-4 was you kind of took this sort of like raw mass and then you like RLHF'd it into a really good chatbot. And that was a huge win, right? Like, going, in the original, I think, InstructGPT paper, RLHF versus non-RLHF model, it's like 100x model size win on sort of human preference ratings. It started to be able to do like simple chain of thought and so on. But you still have a disadvantage of all these kind of like raw capabilities. And I think there's still like a huge amount that you're not doing with them. And by the way, I think this pre-training advantage is also sort of the difference to robotics, right? Where I think robotics, I think people used to say it was a hardware problem, but I think the hardware stuff is getting solved. The thing we have right now is you don't have this sort of huge advantage of being able to bootstrap yourself with pre-training. You don't have all this sort of unsupervised learning you can do. You have to start right away with the sort of RL, self-play, and so on. All right, so now the question is why might some of this unhobbling and RL and so on work? And again, there's sort of this advantage of bootstrapping, right? So your Twitter bio is being pre-trained, right? But you're actually not being pre-trained anymore. You are not being pre-trained anymore. You were pre-trained in like grade school and high school. At some point, you transition to being able to like learn by yourself, right? You weren't able to do that in elementary school. I don't know, middle school, probably high school is maybe when it sort of started. You need some guidance. College, if you're smart, you can kind of teach yourself. And in sort of models are just starting to enter that regime, right? And so it's sort of like it's probably a little bit more scaling, and then you got to figure out what goes on top, and it won't be trivial, right? So a lot of deep learning is sort of like, it sort of seems very obvious in retrospect, and there's sort of some obvious cluster of ideas, right? There's sort of some kind of like thing that seems a little dumb, but that just kind of works. But there's a lot of details you have to get right. So I'm not saying this, we're going to get this, next month or whatever. I think it's going to take a while to like really figure out the details.
A while for you is like half a year or something.
Well, I don't know. I think
that makes a month, 6 months.
between 6 months and 3 years, But I think it's possible, and I think there's I think is also very related to the sort of issue of the data wall. But I mean, I think the one intuition on the sort of like learning by yourself, right, is sort of pre-training is kind of the words are flying by, right? Or it's like, the teacher's lecturing to you, and the models, the words are flying by, they're just getting a little bit from it. But that's sort of not what you do when you learn from yourself, right? When you learn by yourself, say you're reading a dense math textbook, you're not just kind of like skimming through it once. You wouldn't learn that much from it. I mean, some word cells just skim through, reread the math textbook, and then they memorize. And that's sort of, like if you just repeated the data, then they memorize. What you do is you kind of like, you read a page, you kind of think about it, you have some internal monologue going on, you have a conversation with a study buddy, you try a practice problem, you fail a bunch of times, and at some point it clicks, and then you're like, this made sense, then you read a few more pages. And so we've kind of bootstrapped our way to being able to do that now with models, or like just starting to be able to do that. And then the question is, being able to like read it, think about it, try problems. And the question is, can you, all this sort of self-play synthetic data RL is kind of like making that thing work.
Yep.
So basically translating like in context, like right now there's like in context learning, right? Super sample efficient. Yeah. There's that, in the Gemini paper, right? It just like learns a language in context. And then you have pre-training, not at all sample efficient. But what humans do is they kind of like, they do in context learning. You read a book, you think about it until eventually it clicks. But then you somehow distill that back into the weights. And in some sense, that's sort of like what RL is trying to do. And like when RL is super finicky, but when RL works, RL is kind of magical because it's sort of the best possible data for the model. It's like when you try a practice problem and and then you fail, and at some point you kind of figure it out in a way that makes sense to you. That's sort of like the best possible data for you, because like the way you would have solved the problem. And that's what RL is. Rather than just, you kind of read how somebody else solved the problem and doesn't initially click.
Yeah. By the way, if that take sounds familiar, because it was like part of the question I asked John Schulman, that goes to illustrate the thing I said in the intro, where like a bunch of the things I've learned about AI, just like we do these dinners before the interviews, and me, you, Sholto, and a couple, and like, what should I ask John Schulman? What should I ask Dario? Okay, suppose this is the way things go, and we get these unhobblings.
Yeah.
Now
and the scaling, right? So it's like you have this baseline, just enormous force of scaling, right? Where it's like GPT-2 to GPT-4, GPT-2, it could kind of like, it was amazing, right? It could string together plausible sentences, but it could barely do anything. It was kind of like preschooler. And then GPT-4 is, it's writing code. It like, can do hard math. And so it's sort of like smart high schooler. And so this big jump, and in sort of the essay series, I go through and kind of count the orders of magnitude of compute scale up, of algorithmic progress. And so sort of scaling alone, sort of by 27, 28 is going to do another kind of preschool to high school jump on top of GPT-4. So that'll already be just like at a per token level, just incredibly smart. That'll get you some more reliability. And then you add these unhobblings that make it look much less like a chatbot, more like this agent, like a drop-in remote worker. That's when things really get going.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I want to ask more questions about this. Let's zoom out. Okay.
Right.
So suppose you're right about this.
Yeah.
And I guess this is because of the 2027 cluster. We've got 10 gigawatt, 2027, 10 gigawatts.
28 is the 10 gigawatt.
Okay.
So maybe it'll be pulled forward.
Okay, sure. Something.
Yeah.
And so I guess that's like 5.5 level by 2027, like whatever that's called, right? What does the world look like at that point? You have these remote workers who can replace people. What is the reaction to that in terms of the economy, politics, geopolitics?
Yeah, so, I think 2023 was kind of a really interesting year to experience as somebody who was like, really following the AI stuff, where, before that, it was
what were you doing in 2023?
I mean, OpenAI.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And it kind of went, I was been thinking about this and, like talking to a lot of people, in the years before, and it was this kind of weird thing, you almost didn't want to talk about AI or AGI, it was kind of a dirty word, right? And then 2023, people saw ChatGPT for the first time, and they saw GPT-4, and it just like, it exploded, right?
Yeah.
And it triggered this kind of like, huge sort of capital expenditures from all these firms and the explosion in revenue from NVIDIA and so on. And, things have been quiet since then, but the next thing has been in the oven. And I sort of expect sort of every generation, these kind of like G-forces to intensify, right? It's like people see the models. There's like, people haven't counted them, so they're going to be surprised and it'll be kind of crazy. And then, revenue is going to accelerate. Suppose you do hit the 10 billion, end of this year. Suppose it like just continues on this sort of doubling trajectory of, like every 6 months of revenue doubling. It's like you're not actually that far from 100 billion. Maybe that's like 26. And so, at some point, sort of what happened to NVIDIA is going to happen to big tech, like their stocks, that's going to explode. And I mean, I think a lot more people are going to feel it, right? I mean, I think I think 2023 was the sort of moment for me where it went from kind of AGI as a sort of theoretical abstract thing, and you'd make the models to like, I see it, I feel it. And like, I see the path, I see where it's going. I think I can see the cluster where it's trained on, like the rough combination of algorithms, the people, like how it's happening. Yeah. And I think, most of the world is not, most of the people feel it are like right here, right? But I think a lot more of the world is going to start feeling it. And I think that's going to start being kind of intense.
Okay, so right now, who feels it? You go on Twitter and there's these GPT wrapper companies like, whoa, GPT-4o is going to change our business.
I'm so bearish on the wrapper companies, right? Because like they're the ones that are going to be like, the wrapper companies are betting on stagnation, right? The wrapper companies are betting like you have these intermediate models and it takes so much left to integrate them. And I'm kind of like, I'm really bearish because I'm like, we're just going to sonic boom you, and we're going to get the unhobblings, we're going to get the drop-in remote worker, and then your stuff is not going to matter.
Okay, sure. So that's done. Now, SF is paying attention now, or this crowd here is paying attention. Who is going to be paying attention in 2026, 2027? And presumably these are years in which the hundreds of billions of CapEx is being spent on AI.
I mean, I think the national security state is going to be starting to pay a lot of attention. And I hope we get to talk about that a little.
Okay, let's talk about it now. What happens? Yeah. Like, what is the sort of political reaction immediately?
Yeah.
And even like internationally, like what people see, like right now, I don't know if like Xi Jinping like reads the news and sees like,
I don't know what to think
GPT-4,
about
oh
AGI.
my God, like MMOU score on that. What are we doing about this, comrade? And so what happens when the GPT, he's like sees a remote replacement and it has $100 billion in revenue. There's a lot of businesses that have $100 billion in revenue and people aren't staying up all night talking about it.
I think the question is when does the CCP and when does the sort of American national security establishment realize that superintelligence is going to be absolutely decisive for national power, right? And this is where, the sort of intelligence explosion stuff comes in, which, we should also talk about later. It's sort of like, you have AGI, you have this sort of drop-in remote worker that can replace, you or me, at least that sort of remote jobs, cognitive jobs. And then, I think fairly quickly, by default, you turn the crank, one or two more times, and then you get a thing that's smarter than humans. But I think even more than just turning the crank a few more times, I think one of the first jobs to be automated is going to be that of sort of an AI researcher engineer. And if you can automate AI research, I think things can start going very fast. Right now there's already this trend of, half an order of magnitude a year of algorithmic progress. Suppose, at this point, you're going to have GPU fleets in the tens of millions for inference, or more. And, you're going to be able to run like 100 million human equivalents of these sort of automated AI researchers. And if you can do that, you can maybe do, a decade's worth of sort of ML research progress in a year. You get this some sort of 10x speed up. And if you can do that, I think you can make the jump to kind of like AI that is vastly smarter than humans, within a year, a couple years. And then, that broadens, right? So you have this sort of initial acceleration of AI research that broadens to like you apply R&D to a bunch of other fields of technology. The sort of like extremes, at this point you have like a billion just super intelligent researchers, engineers, technicians, everything, superbly competent at all the things, they're going to figure out robotics, right? We talked about it being a software problem. Well, you have a billion of super smarter than the smartest human researchers, AI researchers on your cluster, at some point during the intelligence explosion, they're going to be able to figure out robotics, and then again, that expands. And, I think if you play this picture forward, I think it is fairly unlike any other technology in that it will, I think, a couple years of lead could be utterly decisive in, say, like military competition, right? If you look at like Gulf War I, right? Gulf War I, like the Western coalition forces, they had like 100-to-1 kill ratio, right? And that was like they had better sensors on their tanks, and they had better, more precision missiles, right? Like GPS, and they had stealth, and they had sort of a few, maybe 20, 30 years of technological lead, right? And they just completely crushed them. Superintelligence applied to sort of broad fields of R&D, and then the sort of industrial explosion as well. You have the robots. You're just making lots of material. I think that could compress. Basically compress kind of like a century worth of technological progress into less than a decade, and that means that a couple years could mean a sort of Gulf War I style like advantage in military affairs, including like a decisive advantage that even like preempts nukes, right? Suppose like, how do you find the stealthy nuclear submarines? Like right now, that's a problem of like, you have sensors, you have the software to like detect where they are. You can do that. You can find them. You have kind of like millions or billions of like mosquito-like, sized drones. And they take out the nuclear submarines, they take out the mobile launchers, they take out the other nukes. And anyway, so I think enormously destabilizing, enormously important for national power. And at some point, I think people are going to realize that. Not yet, but they will. And when they will, I think there will be sort of, I don't think it'll just be the sort of AI researchers in charge. I think on the CCP is going to, have sort of an all-out effort to like infiltrate American AI labs, right? Like billions of dollars, thousands of people, full force of the sort of, Ministry of State Security. CCP is going to try to, like outbuild us, right? Like they, their, power in China, like the electric grid, they added a U.S.'s, a complete, like they added as much power in the last decade as like sort of entire U.S. electric grid. So like the 100 gigawatt cluster, at least the 100 gigawatts is going to be a lot easier for them to get. And so I think sort of, by this point, I think it's going to be like a extremely intense sort of international competition.
Okay, so in this picture, one thing I'm uncertain about is whether it's more like what you say, where it's more of an implosion of you have developed an AGI and then you make it into an AI researcher. And for a while, a year or something, you're only using this ability to make hundreds of millions of other AI researchers, and then like the thing that comes out of this really frenetic process is a super intelligence, and then that goes out in the world and is developing robotics and helping you take over other countries and whatever.
I think it's a little bit more, it's a little bit more kind of like, it's not like, on and off. It's a little bit more gradual, but it's sort of like, it's an explosion that starts narrowly. It can do cognitive jobs. The highest ROI used for cognitive jobs is make the AI better, like solve robotics, and as you solve robotics, now you can do R&D and, like biology and other technology. Initially you start with the factory workers, they're wearing the glasses and the AirPods, and the AI is instructing them, right? Because you kind of make any worker into a skilled technician, and then you have the robots come in, and anyway, so it sort of expands. This process expands.
Meta's Ray-Bans are a compliment to their llama.
Well, it's like whatever, like the fabs in the U.S., the constrained to skilled workers, right?
Sure.
You have the, even if you don't have robots yet, you have the cognitive superintelligence, and it can kind of make them all into skilled workers immediately. But that's it's a very brief period. Robots will come soon.
Sure. Okay. So suppose this is actually how the tech progresses in the United States. Maybe because these companies are already experiencing hundreds of billions of dollars of AI revenue.
And at this point, companies are borrowing, hundreds of billions or more in the corporate debt markets.
But why is a CCP bureaucrat, some 60-year-old guy, he looks at this and he's like, oh, it's like Copilot has gotten better now. Why are they now?
I mean, this is much more than Copilot has gotten better now. I mean, at this point, the
to them,
will be
because to shift the production of an entire country to dislocate energy that is otherwise being used for consumer goods or something, and to make it that all feed into the data centers. Will that be obvious? Because part of this whole story is you realize the super intelligence is coming soon, right? And I guess you realize it. Maybe I realized it. I'm not sure how much I realize it. But will the national security apparatus in the United States and will the CCP realize it?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think in some sense this is a really key question. I think we have sort of a few more years of mid-game, basically, and where you have a few more 2023s, and that just starts updating more and more people. And, I think, the trend lines, will become clear. I think you will see some amount of the sort of COVID dynamic, right? Like COVID was like, February of 2020, it's like, honestly feels a lot like today, where it's like, it feels like this utterly crazy thing is about, is impending, is coming. You kind of see the exponential, and yet most of the world just doesn't realize, right? The mayor of New York is like, go out to the shows, and this is just, like Asian racism or whatever, but at some point the exponential, at some point people saw it, and then like just kind of crazy radical reactions came.
Right. Okay. So, by the way, what were you doing during COVID? Or when, like college, February? Okay. College, like freshman, sophomore, what?
Junior.
Yeah. But still, like, what were you, like 17-year-old junior or something? Yeah. And then you bought, like, did you short the market or something? Or?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Did you sell at the right time?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So there will be like a March 2020 moment, that the thing that was COVID, but here. Now, then you can like make the analogy that you make in the series that this will then cause the reaction of like, we got to do the Manhattan Project for America here. I wonder what the politics of this will be like, because the difference here is it's not just like we need the bomb to beat the Nazis. It's we're building this thing that's making all our energy prices rise a bunch, and it's automating a bunch of our jobs. And the climate change stuff, like people are going to be like, oh my God, it's making climate change worse. And it's helping big tech. Like politically, this doesn't seem like a dynamic where the national security apparatus or the president is like, we have to step on the gas here and like make sure America wins.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think a lot of this really depends on sort of how much people are feeling it, how much people are seeing it. I think there's a thing where, kind of basically our generation, right? We're kind of so used to kind of, basically peace and like, the world, American hegemony and nothing matters. But, the sort of like extremely intense and these extraordinary things happening in the world, and like intense international competition is like very much the historical norm. Like in some sense, it's like, sort of there's this sort of 20-year very unique period, but like, the history of the world is like, like in World War II, right? It was like 50% of GDP went to, wartime production. The US borrowed over 60% of GDP, in I think Germany and Japan over 100%. World War I, UK, France, Germany all borrowed over 100% of GDP. I think the sort of much more was on the line, right? Like, and people talk about World War One being so destructive, and like 20 million Soviet soldiers dying, and like 20% of Poland. But that was just the sort of like that happened all the time, right? Like 7 years of war, like whatever, 20-30% of Prussia died. Like 30 years of war, like I think like up to 50% of like large swath of Germany died, and I think the question is, will these sort of like, will people see that the stakes here are really, really high, and that basically sort of like history is actually back. And I think, I think the American national security state thinks very seriously about stuff like this. They think very seriously about competition with China. I think China very much thinks of itself on this sort of historical mission and rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. They think a lot about national power. They think a lot about like the world order. And then, I think there's a real question on timing, right? Like, do they start taking this seriously, right? Like when the intelligence explosion was already happening, like quite late, or do they start taking this seriously like 2 years earlier? And that matters a lot for how things play out. But at some point they will, and at some point they will realize that this will be sort of utterly decisive for, not just kind of like some proxy war somewhere, but like whether liberal democracy can continue to thrive, whether the CCP will continue existing. And I think that will activate sort of forces that we haven't seen in a long time.
The great power conflict thing definitely seems compelling. I think just all kinds of different things seem much more likely when you think from a historical perspective, when you zoom out beyond the liberal democracy that we've been living in, had the pleasure to live in America, let's say 80 years, including dictatorships, including obviously war, famine, whatever. I was reading the Gulag Archipelago, and one of the chapters begins with Solzhenitsyn saying, if you would have told a Russian citizen under the Tsars that because of all these new technologies, we wouldn't see some great Russian revival or becomes a great power and the citizens are made wealthy, but instead what we would see is tens of millions of Soviet citizens tortured by millions of beasts in the worst possible ways, and that this is what would be the result of the 20th century, they wouldn't have believed you. They'd have called you a slanderer.
Yeah, and the possibilities for dictatorship with superintelligence are sort of even crazier, right? I think, imagine you have a perfectly loyal military and security force, right? That's it. No more rebellions, right? No more popular uprisings, perfectly loyal, you have perfect lie detection, you have surveillance of everybody, you can perfectly figure out who's the dissenter, weed them out, no Gorbachev would have ever risen to power who had some doubts about the system, no military coup would have ever happened. And I think I think there's a real way in which part of why things have worked out is that ideas can evolve, and there's sort of like some sense in which sort of time heals a lot of wounds, and time and solves a lot of debates, and a lot of people had really strong convictions, but a lot of those have been overturned by time because there's been this continued pluralism and evolution. I think there's a way in which kind of like if you take a CCP like approach to kind of like truth is what the party says, and you supercharge that with superintelligence, I think there's a way in which that could just be like locked in and enshrined for a long time, and I think the possibilities are pretty terrifying. Your point about, history and sort of like living in America for the past 8 years, I think this is one of the things I sort of took away from growing up in Germany is a lot of this stuff feels more visceral, right? Like, my mother grew up in the former East, my father in the former West. They like met shortly after the wall fell, right? Like the end of the Cold War was this sort of extremely pivotal moment for me because it's the reason I exist, right? And then, growing up in Berlin and, the former wall, my great grandmother, who is still alive, is very important in my life. She was born in 1934. Grew up during the Nazi era, during all that. Then World War II. Like saw the firebombing of Dresden from the sort of country cottage or whatever where they as kids were. Then spends most of her life in sort of the East German communist dictatorship. She'd tell me about in like 1954 when there's like the popular uprising. And Soviet tanks came in. Her husband was telling her to get home really quickly. Get off the streets. Had a son who tried to, ride a motorcycle across the Iron Curtain and then was put in a Stasi prison for a while. And then finally, when she's almost 60, it's the first time she lives in, a free country, and a wealthy country. And, when I was a kid, she was, the thing she always really didn't want me to do was like get involved in politics. Cause like joining a political party was just, it was, very bad connotations for her. Anyway, and she sort of raised me when I was young, and so it doesn't feel that long ago. It feels very close.
Yeah. So I wonder, when we're talking today about the CCP, listen, the people in China who will be doing their version of the project will be AI researchers who are somewhat westernized, who interact with, either got educated in the West or have colleagues in the West. Are they going to sign up for the CCP project that's going to hand over control to Xi Jinping? What's your sense on? I mean, it's just like, fundamentally, they're just people, right? Like, can't you like convince them about the dangers of superintelligence?
Will they be in charge though? I mean, in some sense, this is also the case, in the US or whatever.
Right.
There's this sort of like rapidly depreciating influence of the lab employees. Like right now, the sort of AI lab employees have so much power, right? Over this, like you
but
saw
they're going to get automated, and then
I mean, you saw this in November event, so much power, right? But both they're going to get automated, and they're going to lose all their power, and it'll just be kind of like a few people in charge with their sort of armies of automated eyes. But also, it's sort of like the politicians and the generals and the sort of national security state. A lot of, there's sort of, this is the sort of some of these classic scenes from the Oppenheimer movies. The scientists built it, and then it was kind of and the bomb was shipped away and it was out of their hands. I actually think it's good for like lab employees to be aware of this. It's like, you have a lot of power now, but maybe not for that long, and use it wisely. I do think they would benefit from some more organs of representative democracy.
What do you mean by that?
Oh, I mean, in the sort of in the OpenAI board events, employee power is exercised in a very sort of direct democracy way, and I feel like that's how some of how that went about. I think it really highlighted the benefits of representative democracy and having some deliberative organs.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, let's go back to the 100 billion revenue, whatever. And so these companies,
$1 trillion cluster.
Yeah, the companies are trying to build clusters that are this big.
Yeah.
Where are they building it? Because if you say it's the amount of energy that would be required for a small or medium-sized U.S. state, is it then Colorado gets no power and it's happening in the United States, or is it happening somewhere else?
Oh, in some sense, this is the thing that I always find funny is, you talk about Colorado gets no power. The easy way to get the power would be like, displace less economically useful stuff. It's like, whatever, buy up the aluminum smelting plant and, that has a gigawatt, and, we're going to replace it with the data center because that's important. That's not actually happening because a lot of these power contracts are really sort of long-term locked in. There's obviously people don't like things like this. And so it seems like in practice, what it's requiring, at least right now, is building new power. That might change. And I think that's when things get really interesting, when it's like, no, we're just dedicating all of the power to the AGI. But anyway, so right now it's building new power. 10 gigawatt, I think quite doable. It's like a few percent of like US natural gas production. When you have the 10 gigawatt training cluster, you have a lot more inference. So that starts getting more, I think 100 gigawatt, that starts getting pretty wild. That's, again, it's like over 20% of US electricity production. I think it's pretty doable, especially if you're willing to go for like natural gas. I do think it is incredibly important that these clusters are in the United States.
And why does it matter it's in the US?
Look, I think there's some people who are, trying to build clusters elsewhere. And, there's like a lot of free flowing Middle Eastern money that's trying to build clusters elsewhere. I think this comes back to the sort of like national security question we talked about earlier. Like, would you do the Manhattan Project in the UAE, right? And I think basically like putting the clusters, I think you can put them in the US, you can put them in sort of like allied democracies. But I think once you put them in kind of like, dictatorships, authoritarian dictatorships, you kind of create this, irreversible security risk, right? So, one, cluster is there, much easier for them to exfiltrate the weights. They can like literally steal the AGI, the superintelligence. It's like they got a copy of the, of the atomic bomb, and they just got a direct replica of that. And it makes it much easier to them. They have weird ties to China. You can just ship that to China. So that's a huge risk. Another thing is they can just seize the compute, right? Like maybe right now they just think of this. In general, I think people, I think the issue here is people are thinking of this as like, ChatGPT, big tech product clusters. But I think the clusters being planned now, 3 to 5 years out, like, may well be the like AGI superintelligence clusters. And so anyway, so like when things get hot, they might just seize the compute. And I don't know, suppose we put like, 25% of the compute capacity in these sort of Middle Eastern dictatorships. Well, they seize that, and now it's sort of a ratio of compute of 3 to 1. And we still have some more, but even only 25% of compute there, like I think it starts getting pretty hairy. I think 3 to 1 is like not that great of a ratio. You can do a lot with that amount of compute. And then look, even if they don't actually do this, right? Even if they don't actually seize the compute, even if they actually don't steal the weights, there's just a lot of implicit leverage you get, right? They get the seat at the AGI table. I don't know why we're giving authoritarian dictatorships the seat at the AGI table.
Okay, so there's going to be a lot of compute in the Middle East if these deals go through. First of all, who is it? Just like every single big tech company is just trying to figure out
Not
where they can
everyone,
get it.
some.
Okay. Well, I guess there's reports. I think Microsoft or which we'll get into.
Yeah.
So UAE gets a bunch of compute because we're building the clusters there.
Yeah.
And why? So let's say they have 25% of why does a compute ratio matter? If it's about them being able to kick off the intelligence explosion, isn't it just some threshold where you have 100 million AI researchers or you don't?
I mean, you can do a lot with 33 million extremely smart scientists. And again, a lot of the stuff, so first of all, it's like, that might be enough to build the crazy bioweapons, right? And then you're in a situation where like now, wow, we've just like, they stole the weights, they seized the compute. Now they can make, they can build these crazy new WMDs that, will be possible with super intelligence. And now you've just kind of like proliferated the stuff and, it'll be really powerful. And also, I mean, I think, 3x on compute isn't actually that much. And so I think a thing I worry a lot about is I think the riskiest situation is if we're in some sort of like really tight neck, feverish international struggle, right? If we're like really close with the CCP and we're like months apart. I think the situation we could be in if we played our cards right, is a little bit more like, the US, building the atomic bomb versus the German project, way behind, years behind. And if we have that, I think we just have so much more wiggle room, like to get safety right. We're going to be building there's going to be these crazy new WMDs, things that completely undermine, nuclear deterrence, intense competition. And that's so much easier to deal with if, you're like, it's not just, you don't have somebody right on your tails. You got to go. You got to go maximum speed. You have no wiggle room. You're worried that at any time they can overtake you. I mean, they can also just try to outbuild you, right? Like they might literally win. Like China might literally win if they can steal the weights because they can outbuild you. And they maybe have less caution, both, good and bad caution, kind of like whatever unreasonable regulations we have. Or you're just in this really tight race. And I think is that sort of like, if you're in this really tight race, this sort of feverish struggle, I think that's when sort of there's the greatest peril of self-destruction.
So then presumably the companies that are trying to build clusters in the Middle East realize this. Is it just that it's impossible to do this in America? And if you want American companies to do this at all, then you do it in the Middle East or not at all. And then you just like have China build the Three Gorges Dam cluster.
I mean, there's a few reasons. I mean, one of them is just like people aren't thinking about this as the AGI superintelligence cluster. They're just like, like cool clusters for my, for my ChatGPT.
But so they're building in the plans right now are clusters which are ones that are like, because if you're doing ones for inference, presumably you could like spread them out across the country or something. But the ones they're building, they realize we're going to do one training run in this thing we're building.
I just think it's harder to distinguish between inference and training compute. And so people can claim it's training compute, but I think they might realize that actually, this is going to be useful for, they might say it's inference compute and actually it's useful for training compute too.
Anyway, so because of synthetic data and things like that.
Yeah, the future of training, like RL looks a lot like inference, for example, right? Or you just kind of like end up connecting them, in time. It's you have this like raw material. It's like it's placing your uranium refinement facilities there.
Sure.
Anyway, so a few reasons, right? One is just like they don't think about this as the AGI cluster. Another is just like easy money from the Middle East, right? Another one is like some people think that you can't do it in the US, and I think we actually face a sort of real system competition here because, again, some people think there's only autocracies that can do this, that can kind of like top down, mobilize the sort of industrial capacity, the power, get the stuff done fast. And again, this is the sort of thing, we haven't faced in a while. But, during the Cold War, like there was this sort of intense system competition, right? Like East-West Germany was this, right? Like West Germany kind of like liberal democratic capitalism versus kind of, communist state planned. And, now it's obvious that the sort of, the free world would win. But, even as late as like 61, Paul Samuelson was predicting that the Soviet Union would outgrow the United States because they were able to sort of mobilize industry better. And so, there's some people who, they shit post about loving America by day, but then in private, they're betting against America. They're betting against the liberal order. And I basically just think it's a bad bet. And the reason I think it's a bad bet is I think this stuff is just really possible in the US. And so to make it possible in the US, there's some amount that we have to get our act together, right? So I think there's basically two paths to doing it in the US. One is you just got to be willing to do natural gas. And there's ample natural gas, right? You put your cluster in West Texas, you put it in, Southwest Pennsylvania by the, Marcellus Shale, 10 gigawatt cluster, super easy, 100 gigawatt cluster, also pretty doable. I think, natural gas production in the United States is, almost doubled in a decade. If you do that, one more time over the next, 7 years or whatever, you could power multiple $1 trillion data centers. But the issue there is, a lot of people have sort of made these climate commitments, and not just government. It's actually the private companies themselves, right? The Microsoft, the Amazons, and so on. They have these climate commitments, so they won't do natural gas. And I admire the climate commitments, but I think at some point, the national interest and national security kind of is more important. The other path is you can do this sort of green energy mega projects, right? You do the solar and the batteries and the SMRs and geothermal. But if we want to do that, there needs to be sort of broad deregulatory push, right? So you can't have permitting take a decade, right? So you got to reform FERC. You got to have blanket NEPA exemptions for this stuff. There's inane state level regulations, that are you could build the solar panels and batteries next to your data center, but it'll still take years because you actually have to hook it up to the state electrical grid. And you have to use governmental powers to create rights of way to kind of have multiple clusters and connect them, and have thick cables basically. And so look, ideally we do both, right? Ideally we do natural gas and the broad regulatory agenda. I think we have to do at least one. And then I think this possible stuff is just possible in the United States.
Yeah. I think a good analogy for this, by the way, before the conversation, I was reading, there's a good book about World War II industrial mobilization in the United States called Freedom's Forge.
Yeah.
And I guess when we think back on that period, especially if you read the Patrick Collison Fast and the progress study stuff, it's you had state capacity back then and people just got shit done, but now it's a clusterfuck.
Wasn't it all the case?
No, so it was really interesting. So you have people who are from the Detroit auto industry side, like Knudsen, who are running mobilization for the United States. And they were extremely competent.
Yeah.
But then at the same time, you had labor organization and agitation, which is actually very analogous to the climate pledges and climate change concern we have today.
Yeah.
Where they would have these strikes while literally into 1941 that would cost millions of man hours worth of time when we're trying to make tens of thousands of planes a month or something. And they would just debilitate factories for trivial pennies on the dollar kind of concessions from capital. And it was concerns that the auto companies are trying to use the pretext of a potential war to actually prevent paying labor the money it deserves. And so what climate change is today, you'd think, fuck, America's fucked. We're not gonna be able to build this shit. If you look at NEPA or something. But I didn't realize how debilitating labor was in World War II.
Right? It was just, before at the, sort of 39 or whatever, the American military was in total shambles, right? You read about it and it reads a little bit like, the German military today, right? It's military expenditures, I think, were less than 2% of GDP. All the European countries had gone, even in peacetime, above 10% of GDP, sort of this rapid mobilization. There was nothing, we're making kind of no planes, there's no military contracts, everything had been starved during the Great Depression. But there was this latent capacity. And, at some point, the United States got their act together. The thing I'll say is I think, the supply is sort of the other way around too, to basically